All right, Bible readers, here's the question for today. What do Moses and Paul have in common? Well, it turns out they have quite a bit. And I'm going to lay some foundation for Acts chapter 7. And then we're going to get into this question of what do Moses and Paul have in common? So I'm glad you're here. I hope you're keeping up with the Bible reading program. If you're not aware of it, go check out the link in the descriptions. I run a Bible reading challenge. And currently the program is Acts through Philemon over 23 weeks. It's one chapter a day, 5 days a week. And so go check that out. All right, let's jump right into it. Acts chapter 7. It opens up with a question from the religious leadership asking Stephen, are these things so? So, hey, if you didn't watch yesterday's video on Acts chapter 6, go back and check that out. But here's basically the setup. At the end of Acts chapter 6, we see that Stephen's, we're kind of left in a cliffhanger at that moment. And because Stephen's face is as the face of an angel. So I don't know if it was glowing or something about his countenance changed as God was preparing him to be, what most people call the first martyr. Okay. Stephen ends up getting, by the end of this chapter that we're looking at today, he gets stoned. And I don't mean like smoking doobies, kind of thing. I mean, he gets rocks thrown at him until he's killed. Okay, it's a brutal way to die. But God gave him mercy in that. In fact, it even says, I mean, I don't want to, spoiler alert, I guess, but God says he fell asleep. So, I tend to take God's words literally when there's no reason to think otherwise. It doesn't say, that Stephen lay down as he was asleep or anything like that. It just says he fell asleep. So I think God just in his graciousness just caused Stephen to go into a different state and as he died. And so anyway, let's continue on here. So that's basically the setup is you have Stephen standing up, doing miraculous things, and defying the logic of the religious leadership of his day, and they don't like it and they want to kill him. And so that's how chapter 6 ends. And so chapter 7 picks this up and they're asking him, are these things so? Well, what they're asking him, if these things are so, is because the religious leadership hired false accusers to say that he blasphemed God and all these kinds of things, none of which is true, but it doesn't matter, right? So Acts chapter 7, verse 2 says, Stephen starts what is the most powerful summary of, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. In Acts chapter 7, verse 2, Stephen starts what is the most powerful summary of the history of Israel that I think is ever given, to men. And it opens up with, men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. Hearken means to listen. And so he opens up saying, hey, listen to me. I've got something to say to you. So in his dissertation to the religious leadership, Stephen details on a high level the events of the nation of Israel, beginning with Abraham. Listen, hang with me. I am going to get to this question of what Paul and Moses and Paul have in common, and I hope that you find it interesting. So Stephen accuses this religious leadership of being the betrayers and murderers of the just one, which is Jesus Christ, and concludes with the fact that they have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. Okay, these are deep accusations. So what does this have to do with what Moses and Paul have in common? Well, in Stephen's dissertation, he details much about Moses's life. And what I'm going to do now is compare this to what we know about the Apostle Paul's life. And so for your ease of viewing, I put the specific verse in black, the description of Moses in blue, and the description of Paul in red, just for clarity's sake. So in Acts 7:20, we see that Moses was born while Israel was enslaved by the Egyptians. Okay, while Paul was born when Israel was occupied by the Roman Empire. So there's kind of a similarity here of these Jewish men being born into their nation. They were born Jews, but their nation was either enslaved or occupied, which is really just another form of enslavement. Okay, so they had that in common. Acts 21 and 22. Moses was a Jew, taken in by the Egyptian leader's daughter, so Pharaoh's daughter, and she raised Moses as her own, and he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So in other words, he was educated by the Egyptians. And at the time, depending on what scholar you listen to, the Egyptians had some of the best worldly, secular education that the world knew. Okay, right, wrong, or otherwise, they had very organized religious organizations. All right. Whereas Paul was a Jew, but also he was born in a Roman city of Tarsus. And that's why he was called Saul of Tarsus before he became the Apostle Paul. And he was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel. And so there's this suggestion that from a very young boy, I don't know how young, I don't know if scholars have an opinion on it, it doesn't really matter, but he was taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. Okay, so Gamaliel was touted as being one of the best, legal educators, if you will, of the law of Moses. And so this is who Paul grew up under. So you kind of see the similarity there of these men, these Jews, being born but educated by another culture as well. And so Paul was also, trained up as a Roman citizen. Acts 7:24, Moses had a sense of idealism that led him to defend his brethren to the point of killing an Egyptian. Okay, so let me just read what Paul had a sense of idealism that led him to kill those that believed were blaspheming God, and Stephen being one of those killed for blasphemy. All right, so these men were so passionate about what they believed that they were willing to kill for it. And later on, this is outside of the notes, but later on, Paul expressed the fact that his conscience was clean before God because he believed that he was doing right, and God didn't argue with him about that. And so in that moment, he was doing what the law said, which was killing blasphemers. That was the punishment for blaspheming, by the way. And Paul was just following that. All right, Acts 7:25. Moses believed his brethren would understand who he was and that God had sent him, and the Jews struggled with this truth. Paul believed his brethren would accept his conversion, but there was a period of time where the Jews were afraid of him. Okay, and all the verse references are in the notes. So if you're just listening to this and you're not looking at the notes, you won't see that. But trust me, they're all in the notes, and I encourage you to go read these verses in detail. Acts 7:29 and 30. Moses was a murderer, and it led to a transformative experience, being a stranger in the land of Madian for 40 years until there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. Okay, so think about this experience that Moses had. And then Paul was a murderer, and it led to a transformative experience as he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. Okay, so it's interesting how these men, had this kind of murderous tendency, as well as having this experience of light or fire as God came and spoke to them directly. Acts 7:31 and 34. Moses was directly spoken to and given specific directions of a new thing God was going to do, namely the dispensation of law. Okay, again, the law was given to Moses. Prior to Moses, there was no 10 commandments. There was no 613 Jewish laws. Okay, Paul was directly spoken to and given specific directions of a new thing God was going to do, namely the dispensation of the grace of God. Starkly different from the dispensation of law. In the book of Acts, like I've said before in my other videos, the book of Acts is a transitionary book between the dispensation of law and the dispensation of the grace of God. So if you miss Acts, you're going to be confused. Because if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you just jump into Romans, it's like your mind's going to be blown. You're not going to really understand what happened in between. And you're going to think, oh, I just need to follow the teachings of Jesus. Well, there's a reason why Jesus Christ presented himself to the Apostle Paul, showed the Apostle Paul all the mysteries. There's a reason why. And you need to address that in your life. Otherwise, you're just going to be confused wearing a bracelet that says, what would Jesus do? And I go so far as to say, who cares? Because that's not what Jesus did. Was almost exclusively as the Messiah to the nation of Israel, and they rejected him. So a better question would be, if you want to learn how to live your Christian life today, is ask yourself, what would Paul do? because Paul was left as an example for us as how to live this life in the dispensation of the grace of God. Oh, and I know there's some people right now that are screaming, "What? You can't say that, Jesus." Okay, whatever. Read your Bible a few times, and then come back to me. All right, Acts 7:36. Moses used wonders and signs during his effort to transition the Jews from the captivity to freedom. Paul used wonders and signs during his efforts to transition the Jews, and really, indeed, all those that trust in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, from the bondage of the law to the freedom of grace. Okay? And you can read all about that in Galatians chapter 4. Acts 7:36, we're almost done, hang with me. Moses used a type of water baptism early in his efforts with the Jews, but then it changed to a spiritual meat and spiritual drink. Okay, this is highlighted in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2. Paul used a type of water baptism early in his efforts with the Jews, but then it changed to a spiritual baptism of the Holy Ghost. Again, all the verse references are there. Acts 7:37, Moses spoke of a prophet. Okay, it's a reference to Jesus Christ. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 18. Like unto him, but him shall ye hear. So in other words, Moses was a type of Christ to the Jews, but he was pointing to the real prophet, which was Jesus Christ. All right, Paul's entire ministry was an effort to get the Jews, and indeed the entire world, to hear this prophet, namely Jesus Christ. Acts 7:39. Moses was not obeyed by the Jews as they wandered around the desert for 40 years. That's the whole reason they wandered around in the desert, because every time he would try to do something, they would, "Oh yeah, we'll do it." But then when it came down to it, they didn't do it. And it just went back and forth, and then they never learned the lesson. And so they wandered around. And ultimately, the generations that left the captivity in Egypt never entered the promised land. It was only their offspring that entered. In fact, even Moses himself, for whacking that rock a couple of times when God told him hit it once, was not allowed to enter the promised land. He was able to see it afar off, but he couldn't go in. All right. By comparison, Paul was not obeyed by the majority of Jews and Gentiles that heard him. There's a whole list of verses in the notes that highlight this fact. All right, hang with me. We are landing the plane. Acts 7:40 and 41. Moses dealt with unknown gods. Paul dealt with unknown gods. Okay, go check out the verse references. Acts 7:42 and 43. Moses saw God give people over to worship the creation. Okay, it's referred to as the host of heaven, more than the creator. Paul saw God give people over to worship the creation, i.e. the creature in Romans 1:25, more than the creator. And so they both had this in common in their ministries. All right, last one, Acts 7:44 through 45. Moses was appointed over the tabernacle, making it according to the fashion of that he had seen, and was the minister of law. Paul was appointed over the mysteries of Christ and is the minister of the dispensation of the grace of God. So, I don't know about you, but this has been one of the most exciting studies I've put together. I just love how these men had so much in common, and yet God allowed them to express themselves in so many different ways. They were genuinely their own man, but they were also wholly given over to God. All right, that's all I got for you. I'm glad you're here. If you've watched this far, you're unusual, and I appreciate you the most. 5 long-form videos a week, 5 short-form videos a week. Subscribe to the channel. If you think this video might bless somebody or be an encouragement to somebody, please share it with them. And again, I thank you for being here, and I hope that you have a great day.